So once upon a time, I was scrolling through my feed and came across this particular post by Andrew Sandlin. If your church refuses to stand boldly for preborn life, Christian sexual ethics, and biblical market economics on the ground that these are political issues, you'd better hope that the Trinity, biblical inspiration, and salvation by grace don't one day become politicized. What stood out to me was not so much the post itself, but the reactions in the comment section. I learned that day that even the mention of biblical market economics is a bridge too far for many, and a surefire way to bring the theological keyboard warriors out of the woodwork.
Biblical market economics? Laugh emoji, laugh emoji. Can't wait to hear about biblical market economics as discovered in the modern era. Capitalism is in the Bible, didn't you know? Ha ha ha.
Yes. These deep theological rebuttals are just par for the course in this particular group, though they would prefer to think of themselves as a sort of, let's say, watering hole for the theologically inclined. Now, I'm sure if they had known that their comments would eventually make their way onto a film...
Remember, folks, the internet never forgets. Ever.
They might have mustered up some better arguments. Maybe even some savvy quotes from some really smart dead guys. Who knows? But the fact that the very idea of biblical standards in the area of economics could so easily turn somewhat theologically literate young men into what the Bible calls scoffers makes me think that we may have a deeper problem on our hand as modern evangelicals. Is the idea that the Bible might have something to say about economics really so absurd?
A lot of people will say, well, the Bible's not a textbook on economics. Well, it's not a textbook on theology either, but that doesn't stop people from writing systematic theologies. In fact, the Bible speaks to economics more than it does heaven and hell. In fact, overall, more than it does the church. So to say the Bible doesn't deal with economic issues is false.
Let's get to the point. Let's get to the famous chase. I was told that for decades. And here's my answer. I have 31 volumes of verse-by-verse exegesis of over 700 passages. It's finished. You can read it. Then, having written the 31 volumes, I have 4 volumes that I call Christian Economics. Then I have approximately 10 volumes of supplementary materials that go into the details of the application. Now, somebody who says there's no such thing as Christian economics has a real problem. And it took me 60 years to create that problem for him. We're talking 10,000 pages of material to say there is Christian economics, and somebody who says there isn't had better read at least 1,000 pages of my work, and then he'd better be ready to go into print with footnotes and verses to show I didn't know what I was talking about. If there is no Christian economics, then clearly I've wasted my life, but I think it's a good idea for somebody to look at those materials and say, this is all wrong, and I'm going to go into print to show why it is all wrong.
More often than not, those who reject the idea of biblical economics seek to promote some sort of socialism. This shouldn't be all that surprising considering the current generation's drift in this direction. For Christians attracted to socialism, of course, the idea that the Bible is indifferent on these matters is quite attractive. After all, where exactly does the Bible condemn these ideas?
Where does the Bible teach against socialism? Thou shalt not steal. Look, and it's not that hard. If someone said to me, came up to me in all seriousness and said, where does the Bible say you can't go to an orgy? I say, well, you should not commit adultery. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Well, it doesn't say orgy, right? Well, socialism is simply theft by majority vote. Right? The Bible doesn't say thou shalt not steal except by majority vote. The Bible says thou shalt not steal. Just as the prohibition of adultery presupposes the institution of marriage. The prohibition of adultery makes no sense without the institution of marriage. The prohibition of theft makes no sense without the institution of private property. So when God tells us not to steal, that tells us that property rights are fundamental to God's order for humanity. And I would go farther and say, without property rights, there are no human rights.
Biblical economics is what we today call free market economics or economic liberty. Capitalism is a term probably invented by Karl Marx, which is why I don't use it very much, and it was a term of derision, much as we would use the term racist in a derisive term today. He used capitalism derisively. So I think we have to base our ideas of the free market, of economic liberty on the Bible. And when you do that, you come up with the importance and the centrality as far as in human exchange with property, what we call private property and private ownership of property, and the fact that we can do with it as we will, as long as it's according, of course, to the moral law of God. So it is true that there is no capitalism set forth in the Bible, but we today call economic liberty and free exchange, that's often identified with capitalism, is certainly in the Bible.
Wealth is created constantly, and the only way that you can create wealth is actually through free exchange. You don't dig it out of the ground. Wealth isn't in the ground, wealth is in the mind. Wealth is problem solving. So for instance, let's say I were selling cars and you need a car. I don't know, you need to go to your job, or you have kids who need to go to school or whatever. And you've got to be able to get them there, and the only way to get them there is a car. So you come to me, and I've got cars, because I'm a car salesman. Not really, but in this hypothetical. So I've got a lot full of cars. Do I want cars? Can I spend cars? Can I buy, dentistry for my kids with cars? No, I need money. You need a car. So we trade. You give me some money, I give you a car. We are both wealthier. I didn't fleece you for your money. You came out ahead because you valued the car more than the money, and I came out ahead because I valued the money more than the car. They are equivalent in worth in principle, but to you, what I had was worth more, and to me, what you had was worth more, and we traded. We both came out ahead. That is the beauty of following God's law, which says, first of all, that we have private property, so the socialists are already wrong. And second, that you're not allowed to steal my private property. That's actually one of the 10 Commandments. And oh wait, the 10 Commandments even concludes with, you shall not even think about stealing my property. You shall not covet. You can't take my stuff, and I can't take yours. So the only way that I can get stuff you have that I need is to trade you for value. And every time we do that, the amount of wealth in the world increases. Oppression and slavery and injustice destroy wealth. Freedom and human dignity and respect for life increases wealth everywhere. And the more we can trust one another and respect one another's property and respect the dignity of one another's life and status as an image bearer of God, the more you can do business that is mutually beneficial and everyone prospers together.
The connection between free enterprise and biblical Christianity has not gone unnoticed, even by those outside the faith. One interesting example of this is the famous thesis presented by Max Weber in his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism.
The Weber thesis says that the development of modern capitalism, industrialization, science, all of those things are a product of Protestantism. And in some ways, he's right, although you can really find capitalism in the Middle Ages if you know where to look. He certainly has the right idea on the Protestant work ethic. The problem is he completely misreads where it comes from. Weber says that the Protestant work ethic comes from the Calvinist idea of predestination. And if you're trying to figure out if you're one of the predestined, if you're one of the elect, you start looking for signs for it. And success in this world is a sign of God's blessing, therefore a sign of God's favor, therefore you want to work hard as a way of alleviating salvation anxiety. It's a great thesis, it's a great idea, but it's utterly wrong. And the reason we know this is because we do know we've got sources like Perkins' Golden Chain, which is attempting to do exactly what Weber was talking about, trying to help people to understand where they are in the process of salvation. Are they among the elect? Things like that. And when you look at the golden chain that Perkins set up, all of the signs of election, none of them have anything to do with economic success. So there was a degree of salvation anxiety, trying to figure out where you were in the predestination system, but it wasn't tied to economics. Instead, the reason why Protestantism succeeds in the way it does economically is because they had a vision for what Presbyterians these days call the cultural mandate. That all professions, as long as they're not criminal or immoral, all professions are God-given. They're all ways of serving God because all of them can be done out of love of neighbor. And as a result, working hard in your profession is an obligation before God. It's what God expects of you. It's what God's calling on you is. And it's that degree of hard work combined with also the idea that you want to avoid conspicuous consumption, you want to live a responsible lifestyle, those kinds of things. Well, if you work hard and don't spend all your money, what happens? You get rich. And that's what happens in Northern Europe, in these countries that are influenced by Protestantism. It's actually the idea of the cultural mandate that Weber missed that explains the phenomenon that he was looking at.
Nobody wants to die, nobody wants to be sick, and nobody wants to be poor. Well, God's will is health. Come on. God's will is life, health, and prosperity. It's in the Bible.
At this point, you might be saying to yourself, wait a second. Are you saying that there's a connection between material prosperity in this life and covenantal faithfulness? Isn't that like the prosperity gospel or something?
There will be 50 people give $1,000, and do it right now, or I am finished.
Certainly there was among Protestants and Puritans and others the notion that material blessing tends to be a reflection of God's favor, and of course they would like to save and not engage in conspicuous consumption and so on. Well, that can of course be, anything can be perverted, and that idea certainly can be perverted. There are people that are poor that are godly people, no question about it. But I think in much of Christianity in the 20th century and 21st century, we've gone in the opposite direction. And there's been a strong hostility toward wealth or Christians that are wealthy. But that's not true in the Bible. I mean, Abraham was very wealthy, and others in the Bible were very wealthy. There was a wealthy man that buried Jesus. And wealth in the Bible is, according to the Old Testament covenant, particularly in Deuteronomy, is a reward for long-term obedience. That doesn't mean everybody in the wealthy in the world is godly. There are many ungodly wealthy people. The book of Psalms makes that clear. And there are godly poor people. But long-term wealth is material blessing, not just wealth, money we would say, not just money. Long-term blessing is a reward of long-term faithfulness, particularly intergenerationally and culturally.
One of the things I want to remind people, and then I'll run around and push the other direction, but I want to remind people that when the prosperity gospel people get to talking, they have a lot of verses. There are many verses that talk about blessed you will be in your basket and in your store. Okay, there's a lot of verses. Their problem is that they want to reduce it to very simplistic, reductionistic terms. They want it to operate like a vending machine where blessings and only blessings come out. And the Bible does promise many blessings, and there's a lot of prosperity that will come from the preaching of the gospel. I mean, think about it. A man is converted, a man who's been wasting his life is wonderfully and completely converted. And one of the first things that happens is the cocaine bill goes way down. The alcohol bill goes way down. All of a sudden he can hold and keep a job. Well, what does that do to the family budget? Well, prosperity starts to happen, and then new temptations come with that, right?
Well, the health and wealth gospel is is heresy, but so is the sick and poor gospel. So the notion that if you just obey, you'll automatically become wealthy and can demand things of God is false. The health and wealth gospel is a false gospel. But the sick and poor gospel also is a false gospel. And this is the idea that, well, if I am in poor health, and particularly if I don't have very much, that's an evidence that I'm really truly following the Lord. And all of those people that drive nice vehicles and have lots of money and so on, they obviously are not following the Lord. Well, we're really saying then that God's statements to Israel, his promises to Israel, that if they followed him, he would give them a land flowing with milk and honey and give them all sorts of material provision, is false. And Jesus taught the same thing. He says, anybody that follows me in this life will have lands and all sorts of blessings and friends and so on, all of this material provision, and hardships too, he said, and persecutions. We'll have all of them. But that's simply the idea that wealth is somehow inherently an indication of a lack of spirituality or godliness. That itself is a false gospel. Now, it's interesting that almost all of the people that say that do believe in the promises of the Old Testament, where it says the knowledge of the Lord will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. There'll be great material provision throughout the earth as a result of Messiah. The only difference is they say this cannot happen until Jesus Christ physically returns to the earth to establish a physical millennium, language based on Revelation 20, on the earth. So they're not really opposed to the idea that God's people will one day have great wealth. They're only opposed to them having it in what you call, or they call, the church age.
Now, where the prosperity gospel people fail, I believe, is not in pointing to the passages that teach this, right? But in that they want it to happen in an ironclad way. And the best way that I know of to answer both the doom and gloom gospel people and the prosperity gospel people is by pointing them to that passage in Hebrews 11. After he's named a bunch of great heroes in the faith. And then he has this section where he's talking about, by faith, women received their dead back to life. By faith, men routed armies. By faith, men established kingdoms. And then it goes on, and by faith they were sawn in two. By faith they hid in caves, and the world was not worthy of them. So you have this group of saints, some of who conquer in worldly terms. They rout armies. They prosperity gospel. Others of whom are martyrs. And the Christian faith has got room for both of those. So the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And I know that as the gospel is preached, the current age is the age of martyrs. It wasn't the first and second century. There are more people dying for Jesus now than ever before in history. And I have no doubt that that's going to overthrow kingdoms. I have no doubt that the communist Chinese, their days are numbered. I know that. And when the Christians succeed in overthrowing the godless communists, they're going to be tempted to get fat and sassy, just like American evangelicals have gotten fat and sassy and lazy. And then God raises up someone to chastise us. So it's not all rainbows and unicorns and grassy meadows. I'm not that kind of prosperity gospel. But the gospel does bring about prosperity. It also brings about hardship.
Is equality a Christian virtue?
That's a great question. Is equality a Christian virtue? Yes and no. Equality of opportunity? Yes. Equality of justice? Yes. Equality of the demonstration of respect and love, the exercise of mercy? Yes. But equality of outcome? Absolutely not. It's not possible. We're all different. Some of us will achieve more. Some of us are driven. Some of us are ambitious. Some of us are content with less. Some of us have capacities that will naturally garner wealth and opportunity to us. Some of us don't have those capacities. And the Bible recognizes that there are these differences in the wider culture and does not attempt in any way to level the playing field. What it attempts to do is to make sure that there are not differing weights and measures, that justice is applied righteously, that we do not regard the rich over the poor or the poor over the rich.
Okay, let's talk about income inequality, and it's a great topic. And let me tell you what economists know about income inequality. It's not explainable. The first great studies of income inequality were made in the late 19th century by a scholar named Vilfredo Pareto. And he began studying income distribution in Italy, and then he went beyond Italy. And he found that 20% of the population owned 80% of the land. And he began to research other countries of Western Europe, and he found that approximately 20% of the people had 80% of the income. That's known as the Pareto 20-80 law, and it doesn't just apply to income, it applies across the board in about everything. 20% of the officers in a police department will make 80% of the arrests. 20% of the calls to customer service about a problem, 20% will cause 80% of the losses of the customer service department. The 20-80 rule is one of the most remarkable social phenomena in mankind's history, and nobody knows why it exists. Don't tell me that you have a political system based on centralized power to solve the inequality problem if you can't tell me why this 20-80 distribution exists in every culture studied, and not just in economics, but in actual operational institutions. Don't hand the power to the state, don't hand the hammer to the state until the state has a theory of what it's supposed to hit.
By the way, the results will differ because different people want to do different stuff. Elon Musk wants to go shoot rockets into space. Peter Thiel wants to run a hedge fund. My daughter wants to paint watercolors. They're going to get different economic results. The question isn't whether the economic results are identical. The question is, did they have the freedom to pursue their gifts their way? And the ultimate wealth that the three very different people derive may best be measured in their general happiness and joy from what they did well. So to try to force some equality of result is every bit as moronic as this idea of a zero-sum game. The one is easily falsified, the other is easily falsified. Just ask my daughter to go shoot rockets into space. She's probably not going to enjoy that a lot. And so everyone is made differently. They will get different outcomes, but they must have the dignity of life, liberty, and the opportunity to pursue happiness as God has made them to do with the gifts He has given them. That creates extraordinary wealth. And wealth must be understood ultimately as not the presence of stuff, but the absence of want. Not everybody wants the same things. And so some people can live on less and be happier. Some people need more to be happy. Some people need all kinds of different things. But the issue of wealth is not one of this one or that one has more stuff. It's how readily may this person pursue their own gifts. The light example with John D. Rockefeller that we talked about earlier at the conference. John D. Rockefeller wasn't a robber baron. That's moronic. John D. Rockefeller invented standardized, safe, cheap indoor lighting. How much value is there in that? I mean, there's a reason he became the richest man in the world. Little girls can come home from school and do their homework at night and not go straight to bed after their chores. People can go to the library after work hours. People can go see an opera. People who need a job in the second and third shift can actually work a second and third shift, because before indoor lighting, you couldn't do that. It opened up the world. It is a creative act like unto God's first one. And for that, this huge amount of value is unleashed in the world that we all share in down to this day, and John D. Rockefeller takes maybe that much of it. It's barely a tip. Yeah, he deserved to be the richest man in the world. Indoor lighting's a big deal. And Steve Jobs inventing the iPhone, big deal. And he deserved to be rich off of that. But I get more value every day from that iPhone than I can calculate, not least in my 43 Bible translations on that thing. So in all of these different ways, when you realize that wealth is more than money, it's more than stuff, it transforms your thinking, and you realize that what we really are talking about is the pushing back of the curse, restoring the conditions in Eden and advancing them to the conditions that we see in the New Jerusalem, that beautiful city that will have absolutely no lack of anything, and no one will be without the intimacy of a relationship with God. No one will be without basic sustenance. No one will be homeless. No one will be sick. There will be no death. There will be no sin. That's what we're shooting for. And you're not going to have all that in anybody's lifetime unless the Lord returns. But we can press toward more and more of that. And every time we make a widow better able to live indoors and eat plenty, every time we solve a disease by figuring out a cure, every one of those things makes the world better.
There is a vast difference between generosity and equality. There is a vast difference between charity, which is voluntary, and compulsory tax burdens, which are not voluntary. And what we see in the Bible is the transformation of the heart toward charity and mercy, toward love, toward the care of brothers, the kind of generosity that causes us to want to help others. When we have centralized, compulsory systems of wealth redistribution, you see a drying up of that charity impulse. People then begin to guard whatever they have as best they can. One of the unique things in the United States is that it is largely the poorest and the smallest states in the Bible Belt that have the highest level of charitable giving by far. The big, urban, rich, progressive states have vastly lower levels of charitable giving. They're taxed more. The care for the poor is centralized there, whereas in the Bible Belt states, oftentimes poor states like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, the charitable giving is off the charts. Why is that? Well, it's the Christian impulse. It's the place of the heart to desire to give, rather than the place of the state to force a compulsory giving.
Let's get down to a phrase. Everybody needs a phrase. Okay, here's my phrase. You can't redistribute it if you ain't got any. The goal is to create wealth, and the more wealth that is created, the less burdensome it is to give money away. What does the Bible say about people who are poor? Well, we have the phrase. It's all through the Old Testament. The widow, the stranger, and the orphan. These are people without political power. They have no vote. They have no say. And it is the goal of Christian institutions to deal with the problems of the widow and the stranger and the orphan, somebody who's in troubles. Now, what agency in the Bible do we find that applied to? Well, we find it in the families And in the New Testament, we find it in the church. So we go to 1 Timothy 5, that a man who won't support his family is worse than an infidel. We go to 1 Timothy 3 that says to be a Christian officer, deacon or elder, he's got to be a generous person. He's got to handle money well. And handling money well means being a man showing hospitality. So leadership should come on the basis of people who give money away and give it away sensibly. The tithe goes to the church, but the church has institutional responsibilities to the poor. But then you go to the pastors and you say, Pastor, do you believe that God says that every member of the congregation has a moral obligation to tithe 10% to the church? And you'd think every pastor in the country would say, I do, but most of them don't. So the church says, well, you don't owe us anything in particular. Well, then that means that nobody owes anybody anything in particular, except the government then comes in and says, well, you owe us in particular, and you're going to sign this form and you're going to write the check. And in fact, in the United States, your boss is going to write the check to make sure we get the money. But if Christian leaders say that the church isn't entitled to the tithe, why should we expect Christian leaders to have some developed theory of what Christianity should do for the poor? They don't want that responsibility. They'll do anything to avoid that responsibility. And I think it's another mistake. It's another defection of the church and the leadership of the church to say the Bible doesn't have anything to say about that. So go talk to somebody else. And so people will go and talk to somebody else.
The Bible has a great deal to say about the care of the poor, both in terms of how to build proper infrastructure for the care of the poor, but also how to take up individual responsibility in the care of the poor. There are a couple of essential things that we learn from the whole exercise of biblical compassion. One, centralization is never efficient, never helpful, and it's never recommended in the scriptures. It's always decentralization. It's always devolving charity and mercy to the lowest common denominators. That's why families are the first resort for biblical charity. Families and small businesses and small landholders and small farmers, that's the heart and soul of biblical charity. It is not centralized at the top. If modern history teaches us anything, it is that modern statist, centralized programs to care for the poor simply bankrupt nations and sterilize the natural impulse of people to care for others. We look at the character and nature of so-called benevolent socialism, and what we see is an iron fist and a destroyed culture. The richest nation in South America, the richest nation in South America in terms of natural resources and in terms of immediately renewable sources of wealth, is Venezuela, which is entirely bankrupt and the people are starving, all in the name of a Chavez promise to care for the poor. That's the story of all of history. Every time you have some champion rise up and say, we're going to organize the nation to care for the poor, it's time to run and hide.
As we have seen, the Bible has a lot to say about economics. As Christians, we are not free to go along with the world's ideas about wealth, equality, justice, and charity. We have an ultimate standard. We have the Word of the living God. Why would we want to exchange those truths for the latest fad? Even as we recognize the dangers of the health and wealth gospel, we also want to stay away from the sick and poor gospel, which seems to almost make poverty a badge of honor for the Christian in this life. Proverbs 13:22 says, "A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, but the sinner's wealth is laid up for the righteous." In this passage, we see two important realities. The first is that intergenerational wealth is not just permitted, it should be the general expectation for the faithful Christian, to pass on the good gifts that God has provided to the next generation. And two, we see the eschatological expectation, the fact that slowly but surely, as this world is transformed by the power of the gospel, the ungodly will leave their wealth behind, and it will be inherited by the people of God. These are some of the blessings that will become more and more apparent as the kingdom of Christ extends over the earth. The question for each of us is this: are we acting like the good man of Proverbs 13:22? Are we working in the hope that the fruit of our labors will have an impact on future generations